Lemurin set sail on a moonless night on the 23rd of August 1799 with one other frigate as escort. At first they hugged the North African coast and twice saw British sails in the distance. On one of these occasions Napoleon was sufficiently alarmed to make preparations for landfall, intending to proceed across the desert to some other port of embarkation, but the ships of the Royal Navy stood away at the last minute. Sailing for much of the time in bad weather, Lemurin was forced into the Gulf of Ajaccio on the 30th of September by contrary winds. This was to be Napoleon's last visit to his native island, and he spent a few nights in the family home which Letizia had so expensively refurbished. But all the time he was P1 with anxiety. When learning the latest news from Paris he was heard to say despairingly, "I will be there too late." On the 6th of October Lemurin put to sea again, only to fall foul of the weather once more. And no sooner had the full storm on the 7th blown itself out than English ships under Lord Keith were again spotted. Napoleon ordered the captain to make for Fréjus, where landfall was achieved in the Bay of St. Raphael on the 9th of October. Without doubt Napoleon had been lucky to escape naval interception. When the British realized that Napoleon had passed through their fleets on the return run as well, after a perilous 47-day voyage in the Mediterranean, popular fury was unbounded. A London caricature showed Nelson dallying with Emma Hamilton, while Lemurin passed through his legs. Napoleon was lucky in a second sense, in that he arrived in France just 4 days after the news of his great victory at Aboukir reached Paris. The Directory, fearful that the huge and growing army of malcontented ex-servicemen might flock to his banner, dared not impose on Napoleon the strict quarantine regulations governing all arrivals from the Orient at France's Mediterranean ports. Still less could they object that Bonaparte had deserted his army in Egypt. At 6 o'clock on the evening of the 9th, Napoleon set out on a 7-day journey to Paris, hoping vainly to arrive in the capital before the Directory even knew he was in France. Using rapid relays of post horses, he passed through Aix-en-Provence, Avignon, Valence, Lyons, Chalon and Nevers, arriving in Paris on the morning of the 16th of October. He was delighted with the tumultuous reception he got, especially in Avignon, where the people seemed to regard him as a deliverer. At first sight Napoleon's gamble in going to Egypt and returning only when the Directory was discredited seemed to have paid off. Until the news of Aboukir reached France, he appeared to be losing the propaganda battle. The Battle of the Nile, the revolt of the Angel el-Modi and British disinformation about atrocities had been cleverly played up by his enemies. Most of all, it became obvious that, no matter how many victories Napoleon won in Egypt, in the context of a general European war these made little impact. The sensational news about Aboukir cut through all that, but Napoleon's position was by no means as good as he would have liked. The principal problem was that France's military position had stabilized by the time he returned. In Cairo Napoleon had read a litany of French disasters. In 1799 the Allies finally put their differences behind them and launched a new coalition against France. The Russians under General Suvorov joined the Austrians in a campaign in northern Italy which rapidly undid all Bonaparte's work. The Allies overran the Cisalpine Republic, occupied Turin and forced the French to quit Rome. Suvorov then defeated in succession the French generals Schur, Moreau and MacDonald, while the British reoccupied Naples. By the end of June 1799 the French had lost all their Italian conquests, except Genoa and a narrow strip of the Ligurian coast. Meanwhile in Germany the Archduke Charles repeatedly defeated Jourdan, and opened the passes between Germany and Italy. In Holland the military initiative was held by an Anglo-Russian army under the Duke of York. Such was the situation when Napoleon left Egypt. By the time he arrived in Paris, there had been a rapid turnaround in military fortunes. Facing disaster, the directors made a string of mistakes, but these were capped by the Allies. First, in June 1799, the Directory enacted a conscription law which led to wholesale evasion by draftees. The directors then compounded their error by detaching large sections from Jourdan's hard-pressed army on the Rhine to round up the draft dodgers, and then ensured that Schur lost Italy by insisting on sending every available soldier against Naples. However, the Allies made the egregious mistake of insisting on clearing the Danube and Po valleys of opposition before moving against Switzerland, the strategic key to Europe. Then the Austrian minister Thugut inexplicably decided to switch commanders, with Archduke Charles being transferred from Switzerland to Holland and Suvorov moving from Italy to Switzerland. This caused a delay in campaigning which the French exploited. In September Messina won the Second Battle of Zurich, routing the Russians while Suvorov was being transferred. Even more significant than the military check to the Allies was the suspicion and mutual recrimination the setback engendered. Austria and Russia blamed each other bitterly, and the final upshot was that Russia left the coalition in dudgeon in January 1, 800. Taking advantage of the confusion and bickering, General Ney defeated the Austrians on the Rhine. In Holland General Guillaume Brune brought the Anglo-Russian adventure to an inglorious end, and earned the Duke of York eternal obloquy by a stunning victory in October which had the English scurrying for their embarkation vessels. The consequence was that when Napoleon arrived in Paris on the 16th of October, the immediate military crisis was over, removing the justification for a coup d'état. In particular, the victories by Brune and Messina made it very difficult for the Bonapartist propaganda machine to present its man as the sword badly needed by the Republic. Since Brune and Messina were the new military heroes and fickle public opinion was likely to turn away from him, Napoleon needed to act fast. On the other hand, because there was no obvious necessity now for a coup, he had also to move with extreme caution. While he pondered his next move, he had one immediate decision to take: what to do about Josephine. When they were reunited with their brother, Joseph, and Lucien confirmed the stories about Josephine's habitual adultery with Hippolyte Charles. The affair had recommenced in earnest at the end of 1798. Charles would often stay weeks at a time at Malmaison, decamping when visitors arrived. Charles and Josephine were also a byword for corruption. In addition to the retainers from Louis Baudin for putting army contracts his way, Josephine was also on a huge sweetener of 0 francs from another military contractor, Compagnie Flachat. Almost predictably, when Napoleon arrived at his house on the Rue de la Victoire at 6 a.m. on the 16th of October, Josephine was not there. He flew into a rage and decided to divorce her without more ado. Barrés urged Napoleon to be stoical, but made no impression. Only when the banker Jean-Pierre Collot put the affair in the context of race and debt did Bonaparte cool down. Collot argued that Napoleon would lose prestige if it became widely known that he had been cuckolded. The best course was to wait until he had supreme power, and then settle accounts with his errant wife. Had he known the full extent of her treachery, Napoleon would have been even more angry. She told Barrés that she found his letters from Egypt either odd or droll and, while sending him tepid notes, would be composing passionate and lubricious ones to Charles. According to Barrés, her verbal indiscretion was notorious. In a masterpiece of projection she described her husband thus: "He is a man who has never loved anyone but himself. He is the most ingrained and ferocious egotist the earth has ever seen. He has never known anything but his own interest and ambition." Unaware of these dark currents, Napoleon contented himself with a policy of humiliation. Though urged by his family to move to the Rue du Rocher, Napoleon stayed put and decided to lock Josephine out. He cleared the house of her enormous wardrobe of clothes and sent them down to the porter's lodge, with instructions to the porter that he was on no account to admit her. Napoleon assumed she was with her lover, but the truth was more singular. Alerted by letters from her son Eugene and by confidential advice from Fouché, with whom she was developing a kind of business relationship, she hastened south to meet her husband, hoping to get her version of events in before Joseph and Lucien arrived with the truth. But when she arrived in Lyons, expecting to meet him on the Burgundy road at any time, she learned that Napoleon had already gone north by a different route, via Bourbonnais. She turned round and headed for Paris. 48 hours after Napoleon got to the Rue de la Victoire, a despairing Josephine arrived with her daughter Hortense after a long and tiring journey, the latter stages through thick fog. It was 1 p.m. The porter told her he had orders not to let her in, but Josephine softened him with tears or browbeat her way to her husband's door. When Napoleon refused to admit her, she camped outside the door on the last spiral of a narrow staircase, from where she directed sustained and piteous pleas through the wooden threshold. Eugene and Hortense arrived to add their lachrymose pleas to those of their mother. At last Napoleon relented sufficiently to allow Eugene and Hortense to enter. Tearfully they pleaded her case, adding that her heart was broken. Finally Napoleon admitted Josephine herself. An initial angry explosion and bitter reproaches were followed by a cooling-off period, then by sexual overtures. When Lucien called next morning he found Napoleon and Josephine in bed, beaming with seraphic expressions. The entire Bonaparte family was scandalized and furious at this unexpected outcome, but even Laetitia dared say nothing. Nonetheless, the balance of power in the marriage had decisively shifted, and from this point on Napoleon had the psychological advantage. During this honeymoon period Josephine put him in the picture about his old love Désirée Clary. Napoleon had earmarked her as the wife of General Dufat, but he was assassinated in Rome late in 1797, thus triggering French occupation of the Eternal City. On the 17th of August 1798 she married Bernadotte, apparently more for a desire to be married than because of any overpowering coup de foudre for the Gascon. The marriage was a scheme by the Bonapartist clan to neutralize or co-opt a dangerous political rival. Joseph, Lucien and their wives had attended the wedding ceremony, and Désirée now regularly passed on to her sister Julie Youssef's wife full intelligence on the Bernadotte household, who visited, what was discussed, what was the attitude to Napoleon. Josephine had apparently done her best to conciliate Désirée, but Désirée strongly disliked her and used to mimic her mercilessly to Julie, the only member of the Bonaparte clan to have a soft spot for Napoleon's wife. The dynamics of the extended Bonaparte family were becoming increasingly complex. The constant was the hatred felt for Josephine by all female members of Napoleon's family, Letizia, Pauline and, especially, Elissa. Désirée's distaste is more easily explained as simple jealousy. There is even evidence that Désirée was still besotted with Napoleon and dreamed of displacing Josephine and getting him back. When she became a mother in 1799, she asked Napoleon to be godfather. The subtext was clear: she could bear children while Josephine could not. Napoleon asked that the boy be called Oscar after Ossian, the hero of his beloved Macpherson epic, and Désirée duly obliged. Désirée was an important transmission belt between the ultra-Jacobin circle of Bernadotte and friends and the Bonapartes. She supported Napoleon's ambitions even to the point of spying on her own husband. Bernadotte, besotted with her, turned a blind eye. But she was the focus of sexual jealousy, with Napoleon resentful that an enemy like Bernadotte was married to his Eugenie, and Bernadotte fuming that Napoleon had had his wife's virginity. Napoleon had a talent for making mortal enemies, and no enemy was more inveterate than Jean Bernadotte. Tall, slight, with thick black hair, a colorless face and a huge hook nose, Bernadotte was reputed to have Moorish blood but, like many of Napoleon's followers, was in fact a Gascon. Energetic, ruthless, mendacious and treacherous, Bernadotte professed Jacobinism and had received his political education in the sergeant's mess. Unlike his fellow Gascon Murat, who continued to speak with a thick country brogue, Bernadotte had polished up his accent and gone to some pains to conceal his rude origins. Bernadotte was actually an egomaniac of the first order, whose political beliefs were always a mask for the promotion of Jean Bernadotte. He has attracted widespread odium, and rightly so. Frédéric Masson described him as the most unbearable of Jacobins and schoolmasters, a Béarnais with nothing of the Gascon smartness and happy repartee about him, but whose calculating subtlety always concealed a double game, and who regarded Madame de Staël as first among women because she was the first of pedants, and who spent his honeymoon dictating documents to his young wife. A hot-tempered, paranoid Gascon boaster, Bernadotte had ambitions which always outran his abilities. The fiasco of his 2-month incumbency as French ambassador to Austria in 1798 was matched by the farce of his 2 months as Minister of War in July 1799. The rising star in the Directory, the Abbé de Sieyes, grew tired of his intrigues and prima donna antics at the ministry. The last straw came after Brun's victory when Bernadotte delivered a Gasconade to the effect that he would rather be in the field as a soldier than behind the ministry desk. Sieyes sacked him abruptly. But Bernadotte managed to have the last word by leaking a resignation letter to the press in which he thanked Sieyes ironically for accepting a resignation I had not offered. Of his legendary hatred for Napoleon there can be no doubt. When Napoleon arrived so unexpectedly in France, Bernadotte proposed to the Directory that Napoleon be arrested and court-martialed, both for deserting the army in Egypt and for evading the quarantine regulations. He was the only one of Napoleon's former generals not to call on him at the Rue de Victoire to offer congratulations for a safe return from Egypt. He then refused to subscribe to an official dinner being arranged by the generals for Napoleon until he explained his reasons for leaving the army in Egypt. He added that since Napoleon had not been through quarantine and might therefore have brought back the plague, he, Bernadotte, had no intention of dining with a plague-ridden general. Yet Bernadotte was only one of a host of dangerous political rivals Napoleon had to fend off or neutralize when he arrived in Paris to take stock of the Directory's brittle position. Fortunately for him, few of the rest of them possessed Bernadotte's overweening ambition. Sieyes was already engaged on a scheme of his own to topple the Directory, but needed a sword. His first choice was Joubert, but he was killed in Italy. His second choice was Macdonald, but he refused to take part, as did Moreau, the victor of Hohenlinden. A reluctant Moreau was explaining his hesitation to Sieyes on the 14th of October when news of Napoleon's landing in France came in. "There's your man," said Moreau. "He will make a better job of your coup d'etat than I could." Nevertheless, in his bid for supreme power in October 1, 799, Napoleon faced a situation of frightening complexity. The only certainty was that the Directory was discredited for economic reasons. It was the army that sustained the Directory, and a system of symbiotic corruption resulted. Army officers and war commissioners demanded the right to loot and requisition in order to line their pockets, while the Directory had to bow to the demands of the army, as the government in turn needed the spoils of war to pay bankers, army contractors and other creditors and to raise revenue. But inflation gnawed away at the Director's position. In 1794 the gold franc was worth 75 paper francs, but by 1798 the rate had soared to 80,000 paper for 1 gold franc. The Directory had inherited an impossible financial situation. The state was virtually bankrupt, credit was non-existent and the worthless assignats had been withdrawn. Left with nothing but taxation to finance the war, the directors struggled manfully and even introduced worthwhile administrative reforms and improved the tax system. But there was no way to avoid inflation, and the pressing need for money explained the collaboration of army and government in exacting revenue from the conquered territories. Meanwhile, the government steadily added to its tally of enemies, having already alienated the Catholic Church by its anticlericalism, and the Jacobins by its conservatism. By its forced levy of 100 million francs on the rich, the directors also lost caste among the privileged, nor was there any hope of support from the urban proletariat, or the sans-culottes. Butter and cheese were already luxury items, sugar was heavily rationed, and the price of basics was astronomical. 250 grams of coffee cost 0 francs, a packet of candles 625 francs, 2 cubic meters of wood 7,300 francs. Many families were reduced to hanging a lump of sugar from the ceiling, and this would be dipped into a cup of coffee for a few seconds. The corruption of the Directory was legendary and the hatred entertained for the government proportional. On the opening night of the play Le Cavern, a melodrama featuring 4 thieves as principal characters, a wag in the audience called out, "Only 4, where's the 5th?" The entire theater dissolved into laughter, with the actors actually applauding the audience. Many other contemporary stories testified to the intense unpopularity of the directors. A perfume vendor in the Rue de la Loi was said to have made a fortune out of selling a fan with 5 lighted candles painted on one side, with the middle candle much taller than the others. On the other side of the fan were the words, "Get rid of 4 of them. We must economize." Another story, relating to the swelling throng of Directory clients and hangers-on, concerned a Gascon, said to have sent a letter to the Council of S0. When reproved for adding 3 more knots than necessary, the Gascon replied that he could not put in more than there actually were. And when news of Napoleon's victory at Aboukir reached Paris, the enemies of the Directory went about wearing a pendant, showing a lancet, a lettuce and a rat. Spoken quickly, the rebus signified L and sept lestura. Yet if the Directory seemed doomed by its inability to satisfy any significant social sector, what was to replace it? Apart from supporters of the status quo, there were 3 main groups contending for power should the directors lose their footing. Perhaps the most powerful were the monarchists, who had only just failed to seize power at Vendémiaire and Fructidor. Particularly strong in the south and west of France, the royalists spoiled their chances by infighting, split between the ultramontane supporters of the Comte d'Artois, who wanted a return to the ancient regime, and champions of constitutional monarchy. Although some saw a Bourbon restoration as inevitable, there remained the obstacle that too many people stood to lose from such an eventuality: bourgeoisie, peasants, merchants, businessmen, war contractors, and all other profiteers. The only members of the middle class who had been unable to buy up confiscated property were those without capital, such as pensioners and members of the liberal professions. On the left were the Neo-Jacobins, a powerful force in provincial electoral assemblies and supported by the petite bourgeoisie, artisans and shopkeepers. They were influential in the Council of 500 where the tempestuous Napoleon Bonaparte, still theoretically a Jacobin, had been elected as president, but were ill represented in the Council of Ancients. Having learned from the failure of Gracchus Babeuf that there was no constituency for extremism, they espoused a moderate program of greater democracy, accountability by the directors, and greater provincial autonomy. It was the Jacobins who in 1799 had pushed through the hostage law, making the relations of emigrants responsible for any crimes committed within France, and it was at the Jacobins' insistence that the directors had levied the compulsory loan on the rich. The weakness of the Jacobins was that they were a mere coalition of special interests. Their power was on the wane in 1799, as the attraction of emergency powers and committees of public safety had dimmed after the victories at Bergen and Zurich in September 1799. A sign of the times was the ease with which Minister of Police Fouch closed down the Constitutional Society, a Jacobin club which had hitherto been a bugbear for the Directory. The third party in the ring was the Thermidorians, who wanted to end the revolution on an as-is basis, leaving them as the beneficiaries of the sale of national property. They wanted neither the true social revolution of the Jacobins nor the restoration of the monarchy. These were in essence the people who had held power since the fall of Robespierre in 1794, the veterans of the revolutionary assemblies who now wanted a cosmetic change of regime that would allow them to emerge untarnished by the image of the Directory yet in possession of all their economic gains. These were the men who held power as a result of a whole series of illegal actions, principally the decree of 2/3 against the Royalists, and the Floria coup against the Jacobins. Their hallmark was the ruthless sacrifice of their weakest members so as to cling to power. At root, the Thermidorians wanted a republic dedicated to the interests of the rich, rather like the USA. At that time under Washington and Jefferson, since the great personalities of the Royalist movement were in exile, and those of the Jacobin Club were generals like Bernadotte, Jaume, Dan and Augereau. It was on the Thermidorians and the 5 directors that Napoleon directed most of his attention during the critical period from R6 October to the 9th of November I 799. General Moulin and Roger Ducos were the 2 minor directors, basically non-entities. The 3 key figures were Barras, Sieyes and Goyer. Barras was still ostensibly the key man, still linked to Bonaparte through Josephine, but increasingly perceived as erratic and harboring secret royalist sympathies. Goyer and his stooge Moulin supported the status quo, but because Goyer was physically attracted to Josephine, there were obvious possibilities for Napoleon to neutralize him in any power struggle. The most dangerous man in the Directory was the 51-year-old Emmanuel Joseph Sieyes, who had gradually usurped Barras's premier position on the executive while Napoleon was in Egypt. Sieyes had betrayed Danton and later Robespierre, and when asked what he had done during the Terror, replied, "I survived." This grim cynic now had Barras firmly in his sights, and to this end had constructed a loose coalition of intriguers, including Talleyrand, Fouché and Lucien Bonaparte. The head-headed Lucien, who had brought the Bonaparte family close to disaster by his denunciation of Paoli, nearly ruined things again by shooting from the hip. He started a whispering campaign that Barras had deliberately sent Napoleon and the cream of the army into the deserts of Araby to perish. To cover his tracks, he bracketed Talleyrand with Barras as the 2 men jointly responsible. Barras knew how to deal with the insolent young cub. He brought up the subject of Lucien's illegal underage recruitment to the Council of 500. To save face yet not be expelled, Lucien had to continue his bluster while backtracking on the accusations against Barras. The absurd result was that he ended up accusing his co-conspirator Talleyrand alone of sending his brother and his army to their deaths. By August, Sieyes felt reasonably confident that events were moving his way. Veteran of the 1789 National Assembly, the Fructidor coup of 1797, in which he had had a hand, and a diplomatic mission to Berlin in 1798, Sieyes was a longtime opponent of the 1795 Constitution of the Year 3. Supported by his minion Roger Ducos, he nursed his hatred of the Constitution, and had long wanted to subvert it. Since there was a waiting period of 9 years before the Constitution could be amended, Sieyes's only chance to achieve his aims was through a coup. The arrival of Napoleon in Paris on R6 October added a fresh ingredient of uncertainty to this turbid stew of ideologies, policies and personalities. Perhaps as a result of Josephine, Goyer greeted him cordially on the R6 and scouted Bernadotte's suggestion of a court-martial. However, at a meeting next day with the full Directory, the atmosphere was decidedly frosty. Dressed in a round hat, an olive-cloth frock coat, with a Turkish scimitar at his waist, Napoleon affected not to notice and assured the Directory he was on its side. But immediately afterwards, at his house in the Rue de Victoire, he was importuned by rival groups of plotters and conspirators, each trying to make him over. During one night, the 20th of October, he was positively besieged by visitors. Talleyrand, Roederer, Reynaud, Marat, Bruix, Boulet de Ayamuth and Bruys were some of the elite names who called during a 24-hour period. Napoleon affected to be interested only in the newly reconciled Josephine, and when the trio of Talleyrand, Bruys and Roederer made an after-dinner call at the Rue de Victoire, they found Bonaparte playing trick-track with Josephine. Napoleon's camouflage in the last fortnight of October 1, 799 was clever. He returned to his old ploy of appearing interested only in the affairs of the Institute, meanwhile taking soundings from the principal directors. At first he made overtures to Goyer, intending to become one of the directors. Goyer, who was all affability and reported a conversation in which Sieyes had recommended that Napoleon be shot, expressed his regret that there was no way round the rules stipulating a minimum age of 40 for a director. Influenced by Josephine, Napoleon then inclined towards Barras. Barras wanted to get rid of this dangerous interloper and suggested that he take the field again. Napoleon replied blandly that he had to stay in Paris for reasons of his health. The sparring continued, until at a dinner on the 30th of October Barras publicly insulted Napoleon by suggesting that he should return forthwith to command the army of Italy. Napoleon decided to stop beating about the bush. On the 4th of November he asked Barras bluntly how he would react to a coup to replace the Directory. Barras said he had no tolerance at all for such an idea. This meant that Napoleon had no choice but to throw in his lot with Sieyes, whom he heartily disliked. Meanwhile, Napoleon tried to marginalize the dangerous maverick Bernadotte. The Gascon went to the Rue de la Victoire and told Napoleon in his typical charmless manner that he was exaggerating the corruption of the Directory for his own purposes. "I don't despair of the Republic and am convinced it will see off both internal and external enemies," Bernadotte continued. When he spoke the word internal he glared at Napoleon, and embarrassed Josephine quickly changed the subject. A few days later Napoleon tried again when he and Josephine visited Bernadotte in the Rue Cisalpine. After dinner the two families drove to Joseph's country house at Montefontaine, where there was another violent altercation in the park between Napoleon and Bernadotte. Detailed planning for the coup now went on. There were innumerable meetings with Sieyes and Roger Ducos in the Rue de la Victoire. Fouch, also a party to the plot, made sure the police did not disturb them. Only Napoleon, Sieyes, Talleyrand, Fouch and Ducos knew the full details of the plot. Others were informed on a need-to-know basis. Sieyes, Fouch and Talleyrand, all ex-clerics, agreed with Napoleon that Bernadotte should be excluded as unreliable, a Jacobin and an opportunistic egomaniac, but made strenuous 11th-hour efforts to bring Barras into their camp.